Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Paranormal Now. This episode, during the live broadcast, we had some technical issues, mostly on my end. So my mic had dropped out a few times, so I edited most of that out, but there's still a few moments where you'll hear me kind of drop out for a second and come back in again. So my apologies for that, and I hope you enjoy this episode, nonetheless, with our special guest, Debra McElroy, and this fantastically supernatural and superstitious episode. However you are and whenever you are, welcome, good souls, to Paranormal Now. This is Alan B. Smith. Join us as we traverse the cosmic highway of paranormal portals and tantalizing turnoffs. Tonight's going to be a fun night. We're going to take a whirlwind tour around the world in a mythological tour de force, I think, with Debra McElroy. Actually, McElroy. We'll find out in a moment. I think I've been saying it wrong. Anyway, so we'll get to Debra in just a minute, but we will be talking about so much more beyond just myths and mythology, but how it affects you and superstition, and how superstition changes who you are, maybe, and maybe how you change superstition for the betterment of humankind. I don't know. Perhaps we have saved lives walking under ladders. We'll find out in a little bit. And as usual, if you are in the Northeast, please check out the UFO Monument Park in Sheffield, Massachusetts. It's a really interesting place to go. It is historical. In fact, it is actually documented as such. And, for those of you who have been following that story, Tom Reed has done quite a bit to promote the park and bring attention to it. And what I like, again, about it is that it's a place to go and be reflective about these strange UFO anomalies, paranormal happenings, and it's not a circus. It's a nice contemplative place because we don't have the answers, right? And so we think about them. We measure ideas and theories every week, and it's one of those places where we can go and kind of celebrate that sort of thinking without all the kitsch of toys and ET heads. Though I was just doing an interview with Philip Mantle, and he was telling me that he doesn't necessarily believe that, with all his investigations, that UFOs are run by extraterrestrials or something other than human. And for someone who has been pursuing this and has that belief, it's kind of funny. In the background, you'll see he has just a ton of kitschy UFO green men and alien heads. But, that's the fun of all this, right? I mean, not everybody who listens to this believes all of these theories, and I don't believe everything that I hear either. And I expect that's the same with you. So let's celebrate those events when we can get together, hopefully in the summertime. That would be great, where we can do conferences or go to UFO park monuments and share in our exercise in our open-minded thinking. All right. To call in, the number is 85-KGRA Live. That's 855-472-5483 to call the Paranormal Radio app phone lines if you want to talk to Debra and ask your questions. Perhaps you have a strange myth or legend or local tale from where you come from that has shaped your local culture. We'd love to hear about that. Obviously, many of you, that I'm from New Jersey, so we have the infamous New Jersey Devil, and we all have our local lore that I think that we tell those tales around the campfire growing up. And it does inform us and shape, the kinds of interests that we have in life, and even behaviors. So again, we'll talk about that in just a moment. Dr. McElroy, Debra's author name, is a published author, writer, and copy editor with 15 years professional experience. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Horticulture and a Master's in Environmental Resources. A conservationist, naturalist, and environmental advocate, she spends her time writing nonfiction articles on a variety of topics, as well as writing books on contract for publishers. Her most recent book is titled Superstitions, a Handbook of Folklore, Myths, and Legends from Around the World. Debra, welcome to Paranormal Now.
Hi, Alan. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. So I get giddy when we get to talk about these kinds of things because on this show we cover such a wide array of strange topics. And it's funny that oftentimes society, looks at these strange topics as almost aberrant. And you have a creature.
Sorry.
You speak. This is the nature of cats.
Yes.
And she's adorable. And, so we talk about these subjects, and for some, they think, oh, this is crazy stuff that you're talking about. But humankind has embraced odd stories and odd speculation for millennia, whether it's through religion and those mythological stories, or, the stories that we'll be speaking of tonight. So, Debra, it is McElroy or McElroy.
McElroy would be technically correct, but we answer to McElroy also.
Okay, because we have McElwain in my family.
Yep. Yeah, it's that Scots-Irish thing.
Yep, exactly. Yeah. Okay. So what got you into the mythological and superstitious in the first place, or were you catapulted into it, and how did you take to it?
Actually, it was interesting how it came about for me because I've always had an interest in like mythology and not necessarily superstition, but more like folklore and legends and things like that. I have a particular passion for Irish mythology and Native American mythology and legends. So when this opportunity to write a book came to me, I jumped all over it because I'm like, oh gosh, you're right in one of my key interests. And
is there any one particular culture or stories that you were exposed to growing up?
Well, I was raised Catholic, and that is accompanied by all kinds of mythology and, ritual and things like that in any realm could be considered superstition or mythology. Mythology is attached to religion in all cultures. So one religion's myths or another religion's saints, and things like that.
Yeah. What do you think comes first? Do you think it's the religious pursuit and then we'll overlay mythology, or is it the vice versa?
I would say that based on my research, that it's more like we seek something to explain the unexplainable. And so whether you want to call that religion, whether you want to call it myth, whether you want to call it superstition, I would say that curiosity, that yearning definitely comes first before any kind of religion, and the things that come after it, the things we attach to that yearning, are what follows from that.
Yeah, I think yearning is a good word, right? I mean, I feel like we're just born into life yearning right from the get-go.
Yes. I know that there's a lot of the 12-step programs, and again, you can find mythology and whatnot in every single walk of life. It doesn't have to strictly be religion, but 12-step programs, for example, often talk about the God-shaped hole, right? And these are programs that teach spirituality to fill various needs that we feel like we're missing. Like for Alcoholics Anonymous is the penultimate, the premier 12-step program, and most of them have been modeled from that. But Narconon and Gamblers and all of that stuff are trying to use spiritual solutions to fill the things that we've been using our addictions to fill that hole with.
And where does the hole come from in the first place, do you think?
I think that it's inherent in humanity. You can certainly go way, way back before humans were ever even living in civilizations. When we were living in tribal groups, we were all overwhelmed by the things that happened in nature. We knew only what we knew day to day to survive. Like we knew that if there were 10 of us, we had a better chance of surviving that tiger attack than if there was one of us. So we learned to keep together in groups, right? And then, the bigger the group became, then you had to figure out a way to keep it consolidated that didn't depend on that fear, right? Sure. It didn't depend on the fear. So if you want to keep the group together, you have to find something in common. And the things that we've become in common have to be more than just, we all like the taste of mammoth meat, right? It has to be something like this is our culture. We've come to call it culture, but the things that we have in common as a group, the way we live day to day, has become our culture, and those things help keep our civilizations, our family groups, our tribal groups together.
Mm-hmm. I guess I missed out on the meat eating community aspect as I am a vegetarian / pescatarian. No, nothing against vegetarians here. But even something like we were speaking earlier, like coffee, right? Mm-hmm. There is something kind of even communal about that, like any kind of shared experience. Maybe right. Like someone likes micro, brews. Maybe somebody likes coffee. Maybe, I used to be a smoker. And so when I would, step out of work or wherever, there was a little group of smokers that you would tend to see and talk to and chat with. And that was like a little sub community as well.
Definitely.
So we have all these different levels of community in our life.
Mm-hmm.
Where do beasts and crazy tales come from?
I'm sorry, you cut out.
Beasts and crazy tales. Where does that come
from? I think part of the thing when you talk about the monsters mythos, I will call them in general, the monsters mythos is born out of our fear, right? We keep together in groups trying to conquer that inherent fear that we have as mortal creatures. We all know that someday we're going to die. It could be tomorrow. It could be 50 years from now, but we're going to die. And so we carry that fear of death around with us day to day to day. And once we develop these ways to manage that, whether you call it religion, spirituality, community culture, whatever you want to call it, when we find ways to manage that, then we kind of tend to want to splinter it, right? Because we're not all happy being Christians, for example, or we're not all happy being UFO aficionados, for example, right? So we're like, okay, we have our ways of managing the fear, but we're going to splinter now because your way of managing it doesn't necessarily fit exactly with the way I want to manage it.
Yep.
So I think that's how those monster things, those things that seem so much greater than us, are splinters, right? Because the fear of there's nothing like the fear of the unknown, mm-hmm. right? We can manage fear by giving it a name. So if we say we have the fear of death with us, then we can call death Satan. We can call death, the end of all things. We can call death, one of the four horsemen or whatever you want to call it. By naming it, we make it smaller. We make it more understandable. Uh-huh. So when you have these monster creatures, by saying, "Oh, look, there's what I'm afraid of," right? If I can name my fear Godzilla, or some other kaiju, or I can name my fear La Llorona next to the river or whatever. By naming it, I can control it better.
So we faced our fears with these monsters. Do you think that modern day cryptozoology, Bigfoot, Chupacabra, are these manifestations of our mythic imagination, or could these be real? What's your take on all that?
My take is that I think it could be a combination of things, right? I think something like Bigfoot probably had its beginnings in what was real tales, right? You could say, well, maybe it was a grizzly bear, or maybe it was some creature that has now become extinct, or it was shadows of the trees or whatever. But whatever it was that originally started it, it was something real. And then it has evolved into the entertainment industry that it is now, right? So if you were to say to me, do you believe in Bigfoot? I could say, I believe in a certain aspect of that, right? I believe that it had some root in fact. I believe that it has become twisted into this unrecognizable state now. And so I would say, no, I don't believe in monkey man walking through the woods, but I do believe that there was some mythical, spiritual creature of the forest at one point.
Well, I certainly entertain the idea that Bigfoot could be real. And we do know that there are a multitude, a huge branch of hominids that were our relatives, throughout the past, 10,000 plus years. And I mean, Homo naledi was up until 10,000 years ago, roughly, shortly before the Neanderthals went extinct. They went extinct. And, maybe could it possibly be that there's some bipedal ape that's in between the shadows here and there? I think it's possible. But I think what's most intriguing is our attraction to it. And that, we're drawn in by the mystery of asking the questions. And do you think, in terms of mythology, do you think we're supposed to have answers?
Well, to me, that's a two-part question, right? Sure. In the first place, I think we need to have answers as humans, because we have that hole, whatever that hole is. We have that hole that yearns for something. And so we need to have answers in an attempt to mend that hole. And the second part, are we supposed to have answers? That would depend on, what is your belief about what lives outside of us, right? If you believe in a higher power, whatever you call that higher power, then you have to decide according to the culture of your belief in a higher power, does it want you to seek answers, or does it simply want you to be obedient? Right? Does it want you to join it sometime in the spiritual realm? Does it want you to work towards that? Or does it want you to stay on earth, learn your lessons, and, move on to the next life?
Right.
So I think you could argue that we want them, and I don't see anything wrong with feeling like we're entitled to them.
So the big questions of what's our purpose? How did it all start? Are we chasing our tails? Will we never find out? Or are those truths embedded in the myths somehow?
I think as far as finding our purpose, from my point of view, I think that purpose is attached to every individual, right? So I think that my purpose for my life is going to be different than yours. So if you were to say, what's it all about? I would respond that I think the purpose of this life is to discover what is the question that each of us wants answered, right? So in the case, I've tried to think about this a lot from my own point of view. And if I have to say, what is the question that I want answered? I always want to know why. right?
Wow.
I want to know, why do these things happen? Right. The big why. Why do these things happen? What is the reason? How do we go about it? But why? And a lot of people, maybe their big question in life is, how do I, right? How do I do X? Or somebody else's question may be, where can I find what I need, right? Do I find it by finding the right career? Do I find it by becoming a spiritual leader or a world leader or something? Where do I find what I need to satisfy that hole in me?
What is your favorite creative myth in your research? The creation myth.
Oh, there's so many really wonderful creation myths. One of the ones that comes to mind is it's a myth about it's an African myth. I'm sorry, I can't tell you which country it is specifically, but in this particular African myth, I think it's 3 women, 2 or 3 women, 5 men, a dog, and a leopard come up from the underworld. This is just the term that they have, the underworld, through the mouth of a cave and emerge onto the surface of the earth. And from there, they create humanity. And one of them is First Man. He has a name, and in African they call First Man. And he teaches all of the others how to build shelters, how to hunt food, how to do the things they need to do to perpetuate life and to succeed. And then I find it fascinating that we have a domestic animal, dog, which, in so many of our cultures is indispensable. And then the wild represented animal as leopard. In Africa, you probably know leopards are very, very dangerous. They're very powerful animals, more so even than lions. And so to include that as part of the mythology of the creation mythology is really interesting to me.
You were raised Catholic.
I was, yes.
So are you still religious, or do you look to those stories for inspiration?
I am still very, very spiritual. I am not a strict Catholic anymore, although I do still wear a crucifix. But I do that more as a reminder to myself to be spiritual, right? To be open to contact from my higher power, to pause during the day for silent reflection, which for me is so important because I tend to be very tense. I'm a type A personality, and so I get just kind of freaked out if I don't take a few minutes during the day to just chill. And so that's what that symbol represents for me, more than it does, the crucified God.
Okay. And we also see that in mythology too, right? The sacrificial lamb, as it were. Mm-hmm. And what is that? Why does that resonate with us so deeply?
That's a really, really deep question. I think there are a lot of things that go into that. I mean, if you talk about the sacrificial lamb, you automatically invoke innocence, you invoke helplessness, you invoke a creature that isn't in control of what happens to it, right? And so if you subsequently sacrifice this creature, what you're saying is, we are giving you this element of ourselves that is naive and youthful and open. Mm-hmm. And we are asking you to transform it into something more, I don't want to say more mature, but more capable of being in the world. Does that make sense?
It does. In the context of that religious system, or tradition,
right?
Is sin something that is inherently evil, or because based on what you said, couldn't sin occur out of naivete, out of actual innocence?
Oh, yes. In the Catholic religion, it happens all the time. I mean, babies who die before they're baptized cannot go to heaven. in the Catholic religion. And that's through no fault of their own. They've certainly done nothing wrong. They haven't even lived long enough, to have sinned in any fashion. It's simply because they haven't undergone the proper sacrament. That means they can't enter heaven. So I think that that's a terrible thing. I used to question the sisters about that. And they're like, well, they go to purgatory and it's not the same as hell. And I don't want to fall down the rabbit hole of Catholic dogma, but it is fascinating to just talk about whether you think sin is something that is inherent in humanity or whether it's something that we kind of seek out, right?
Right. All right. Well, we'll continue this conversation on the other side of this first break. I'm talking with Debra McElroy, and we will be discussing her book, which you can find on Amazon. It's Superstitions, a Handbook of Folklore, Myths, and Legends from Around the World. And yeah, we will be talking about some of those superstitions. I'd like to find out, Debra's top 3 superstitions that she has found the most entertaining in her research. This is Alan B. Smith for Paranormal Now on KGRA Radio every Sunday, 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll see you on the flip side.
Ocean and you are the sky. I need to swim free and you need to fly. I live for daylight, you live for the night. You love to wander and I want to be right, but the sweetness in me needs love, bitter in you.
Mainstream media's most wanted. KGRARadio.com.
I'm a mess, but a hot mess. Dreaming with my eyes open. I'm a mess, but a hot mess. I'm not scared of being broken. I've been going and I don't wanna be found. Go and I don't wanna be found. I live for the night.
Welcome back to Paranormal Now. This is Alan B. Smith. I'm with Debra McElroy, and we will be discussing superstitions, mythology, legends, and I guess a little bit of spirituality and metaphysics, as it were. Although those two subjects always seem to fall into any category we discuss, and I think that's just because they're universal curiosities that kind of imbue and embed and infuse every aspect of who we are. Taking us out of the break was music by Lizette Xavier. If you'd like to find out more about Lizette, go to lizetteXavier.com. All right, so Debra, let's start with your top favorite superstition that you came across, or maybe it's something we all know.
My favorite superstition, at least one that is explicable, is throwing coins in a fountain.
Uh-huh.
And the reason that is so universal is fascinating, because back in historical times, coins were frequently made of copper, and copper tends to dissolve in water. And by doing that, it acts as an antibacterial and a fungicide. Mm-hmm. We still use copper-based fungicides and products like that today. Yeah. But thousands of years ago, they could not have told you the mechanism by which that happened, but they knew that if they threw copper coins, the water was better. Somehow it was safer to drink. It was purer, right? And so they attributed that to the magic, that somehow, maybe you were paying the genie of the water fountain, and that meant that he kept the water clean and safe to drink. So I just thought that was tremendously interesting, the way that particular myth has proceeded through time.
That is really fascinating. In fact, after the pandemic, many people, when they were shopping for their homes, they were looking at faucets or faucets with brass handles and copper handles. I knew that was a kind of a trend. So was it by accident then, right? We're guessing that these brass or copper rather was in the water, and they just realized, wait a minute, this water's not killing us.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Basically, it because so many of the coins were copper. I think it took a long time before they were able to discern that gold coins weren't affecting the water and silver coins aren't affecting the water so much, that it's copper. And eventually, as chemistry progressed, they were able to say, oh, well, that makes sense because la da 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 da. But the myth persisted even though they didn't know why it worked. So I thought that was really interesting.
Are there any superstitions that we live with now that came out of ancient Egypt?
Ancient Egypt. Well, black cats are one of them. Cats were always sacred to Egyptians. There were a lot of reasons for that. One of the major was that they kept vermin out of the grain. Egypt was one of the first great civilizations to store grain to prevent starvation. So they always had these big stone cisterns, if you will, that they put all of this grain into. And of course, the vermin were attracted and they could eat an entire winter's worth of grain. But the cats prevented them from doing much damage as far as the grain stores. And that thereby the cat became sacred in Egyptian mythology. Nowadays, we associate cats with all kinds of different things. They became associated with witchcraft and magic and sort of demons and that sort of thing. But the particular superstition about black cats is attached to a couple of different things. In addition to a cat's position as a magical creature, it is also associated in its black form with witchcraft. I think that's because black in general is considered like the antithesis of white, white light is what I mean. And so anything that is dark like that is considered evil if you're talking about witchcraft. So, Gandalf never wore black robes. Gandalf had more of a grays and that sort of thing. But anyway, I'm getting off track. Black cats are inherently evil because of their sacred status and the prohibition against them being black. Nobody ever says if a tortoiseshell cat crosses your path, you're in trouble, right? It's only a black cat. Mm-hmm. So I think it's mostly because of the association with the dark arts of magic.
I see. So Maya, our cat, is a tuxedo. So she's mostly black with a couple splotches of white, but in the night she can appear as a demon. The glare of her eyes looks at you, and it's freaky.
It is a fact. The Humane Society and the ASPCA both say that adoptions of black cats are considerably less than adoptions of cats of any other color.
So that's so funny because I never take cat people to be. Cat people tend to love cats of all kinds. So I would never imagine that they would, discriminate based on superstition.
I know. I wouldn't have either thought that. I would definitely think that people who don't like cats would say something like that. But cat people, that would surprise me. Yeah.
And you were talking earlier before the show how your cat, gets on your face.
Yes.
She in the morning when she wants food from us, she jumps on our chest. And she around, and sometimes she'll step right on my throat, and I won't be able to breathe.
Yes.
So I'm the question is, does she know what she's doing when she's doing that, or is that an accident?
She absolutely knows what she's doing. Cats speak by body language, right? Cats don't bark, they don't growl. I mean, occasionally you'll hear a cat growl, and if I hear my cat growl, I know something's wrong.
It's a protective thing. Yeah.
Yes, she's angry and worried if she's growling. But when they're talking to humans, they meow only to get our attention, right? Dogs make all kinds of noises, but cats just, once they have their attention, then they use body language. They tip their ears, their tail stands up or it cocks back and forth. Their backs raise up and they just shift their weight around and the way they look at you, they'll tip their heads. So once you start, I've spent my life with, understand the way they communicate, that when they put their foot on your face, they know what they're doing.
Yeah.
It's like, shut up. You're not paying attention to me right now. I'll put my foot on your eye and then you'll be paying attention to me.
Your attitude is, I don't care.
That's right. It's me.
But they can be the sweetest things too, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
In mythology, we often think about big, heavy episodes or scary creatures or dire ends. Are there any lighter myths that you came across that were, more uplifting and kind of gentle?
Mythology, because it is almost always connected to religion, it's hard to find a lot of uplifting mythology. There's a lot of fun kind of things attached to superstition because some of them are just downright silly, and there's interesting things connected to numerology and zodiac and that kind of thing. But mythology by its nature tends to have more gravitas. Because it's something that, again, we've developed to fill that hole. So because that hole is so prominent and it's in every one of us, we don't joke around with it for the most part.
But it's not just to fill the hole, right? It's to teach lessons, life lessons.
It is, absolutely. It has become much more so. But I think when it first developed, as religious practices, today's mythology was yesterday's religion. So, it developed the same way we use tales of Christ or Abraham to talk about the life lessons that we want to teach now. They used it then to do the same thing and to explain natural phenomenon, which is a difference that our modern religions don't tend to use religion to explain natural phenomenon. Okay. Like thunder is the god Thor and his hammer, right? He was an absolute god and a real religious figure, but he also is responsible for this natural phenomenon. And that was part of his role as a god, was to produce the thunder or control the rain or bring the lightning or whatever his particular role as a god was. And our modern gods don't carry that kind of thing, right? We don't say that Jesus is responsible for creating the rain the way that ancient mythology would.
Right. Although there was one god that did it all, basically.
There was, although I think when you mostly look at mythologies, any of the monotheistic mythology tend to be much more considering that God himself. How am I going to say this? You don't really think of praying to God to stop the thunder, right?
Okay.
You can still pray to God, like if you've been in a drought for 6 months and you need rain, it's like, please God, make the rain. But you're imploring him as a power being, right? The ultimate being to bring the rain. Whereas if you were in a polytheistic religious society or a mythological construct, you would have a specific God who was responsible for bringing the rain, and to him or her you would say, please bring the rain, or you would sacrifice to them, or you would pray, or whatever you would do, so that because that is his role, right? His role is to bring the rain.
I see.
So can you see the difference?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, in Hinduism,
I wasn't sure if I was being clear.
No, absolutely. In Hinduism, it depends on who or what your issue is, whether it's love or money. You pray to Ganesh versus I can't think of the god of love right now, but it just depends. So where do we think, what do we think is the funniest or most silly superstition that we do now, or maybe something that is of old that we dropped because it was so silly?
Well, one of the interesting things that we continue to do now is talk about, for example, opening umbrellas indoors.
Mm-hmm.
And that developed actually in the 1800s. Before that, it didn't exist, and that was because umbrellas didn't exist, right? Well, the reason that it originally became a thing was because those old umbrellas were on like, what do they call it? Like a bullet kind of ejection system, right? So that when you press this button, that loaded spring threw that giant canopy open with really prominent, very strong steel ribs, right? It was dangerous. You could really hurt somebody. I mean, if you had that umbrella open or closed at your side and you push that button and that thing sprang open with enough force, it could, if you had a little kid running beside you and that thing sprang open, it could poke them, right? Or if you did it indoors specifically, there were lots of little glass knickknacks and lamps and, things that because of the tremendous force in those old umbrellas, they could get knocked over and broken very easily.
I would bet that everyone listening tonight has had one moment awkward and uncomfortable with an umbrella.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, they're ridiculously, it's like they're incongruous. You look at it and go, what could this possibly be for? And then once you utilize it in the manner of which it was meant, then you're like, well, obviously that's what it's meant for. But imagine finding that. Can you imagine if you find that thing 2,000 years from now and somehow they've created a different system for keeping the rain off you? And they're going to be going, and especially since all the fabric will probably be gone.
Yeah.
They're going to be, what is this?
The fishing tool of some
yes, or some kind of communications device, right?
Well, in Extraterrestrial E.T., the movie,
yes,
right?
It could be.
It wasn't like an antenna phone home.
If I found something like that lying around, my first thought would be antenna.
Yeah, exactly. It's one of the most awkward and yet efficient technologies that we've created.
Which is why it hasn't changed in 200 years, right? Yeah. We haven't been able to improve on the umbrella, despite the fact that it's big, it's awkward, it's clunky, it's semi-dangerous, they get lost easy.
Good point.
Yeah.
In North American, Native American history, have you heard stories that are kind of like trickster stories? Have you heard stories that are kind of humorous in their own right here in North America?
Much of what is in North America was brought from elsewhere, right? If you talk about Canadian North America, most of that was settled by the British and the French. So they brought a lot of their superstitions and mythologies. Obviously, there's a lot of movement of enslaved people, and they brought from Africa a lot of their mythology. And even if you go back to what we now call indigenous, the truth is that there is no human life indigenous to North America, right? It all came from Europe and Africa. So if you go way, way back, all of the people who came over from the land bridge and from Asia and from Polynesia brought their own mythologies too. And a terrific example of that is in South America. It's a good luck symbol is an elephant with its trunk raised. There are no elephants in South America, right? Yeah. So where did that come from? It had to have come from the origins of a people who knew what elephants look like, right? So you think, okay, we're talking Asia. There are lots of Asian elephants. China, Mongolia, places like that. That they brought that to them to North America from Asia. So that's really interesting to me.
Well, it could be the woolly mammoth, right? Because only up till 10,000 years ago, the woolly mammoth was around, right? In up way up north, like in Greenland, or even in some parts of North America.
There were mammoths in North America, but not in South America, right?
Couldn't you have brought that down, just straight down?
They could have. Yeah, they could have. Absolutely.
And then the question, I don't know what you're referring to, but would it be distinguishable by fur or non-fur? Or because if it's non-fur, right, then that would be an elephant, not a mammoth.
Correct. And there's differences in the tusks and things like that. But the specific superstition is an elephant with its trunk up.
Yes.
Now, of course, mammoths have been extinct for 10,000 years. So that image could have simply morphed into something that exists now that didn't exist when they actually brought the mythology with them.
Although it is kind of hard to imagine holding on to something that has been lost for thousands of years, because as a culture, we do drop things, right? Like we have belief systems, we have stories, we have words that we stop using within just 100 years. So
yet, in mythology, one of the fascinating things is the way that those myths hang on.
Uh-huh.
One of my favorite things that I discovered is not just creation myths, which overlap with each other and have so many similar characterizations to them, but in almost every culture on the planet, there is a flood myth.
Yes.
Okay. Why? Right? Why does a desert people have a flood myth? Right? Why do people who live in the Arctic Circle have a flood myth? It's so interesting, and we can speculate, right? Not that long ago, somewhere in the 50s to 60s, there was this idea of what they were calling race memory. And it was supposedly the notion that great catastrophic events could become ingratiated or ingrained, if you will, into the DNA of the people who lived at that time, who survived whatever that event was, and that they subsequently passed that on to their descendants. Now, that idea has been more or less debunked since then, but it was a huge thing in the 50s. And, you wonder, okay, why is this myth go all the way back to before the Egyptians, that this great flood, engulfed the earth and only a few people survived it?
Yeah.
And one of the most fascinating explanations that I've heard from it that is being considered by modern science is the retreat of the glaciers, right? If you imagine the end of the last ice age, 10, 11,000 years ago, half the planet was covered with a sheet of ice like 3 miles thick. Half the planet.
Yeah.
So as that thing started to retreat, imagine all that water, right? It didn't matter where you lived on the planet. You had an abundance of water flowing through your little part of the world at that time. And that would have been over a couple of thousand years at least, right? As these things started to warm and retreat. So it made sense to me, I think, that all of these disparate cultures have the idea of the Great Flood as this a reason to explain this sudden rise in sea level, the sudden disappearance of land that they had been historically able to live on and farm as suddenly underwater. And if you attach it to a historical artifact like the retreat of the glaciers, for example, then it makes sense why that myth would persist through all the cultures and continue down into today's world still.
Anansi, the spider god. Can you tell us about Anansi?
Anansi is a great example of an African myth. Anansi, the spider god, was a kind of a fringe god in Africa. He was part of a great pantheon, of African gods. And And the reason that he became a thing later on was because, and then this is according to my research, is because the enslaved peoples who were brought over to the Caribbean and over to North America brought with them their pantheons, and they kind of like clung to them as a way to resist the changes they were being forced to undergo. Right. In North America, I'm a little more familiar with North America than I am with the Caribbean, but in North America, they were being forced to change their languages, forced to change their traditional ways of dress, their traditional ways of collecting food and all of that. And so by holding on to this mythology and the belief in this mythology, they were able to stick it to the people who were trying to make them change it. Mm-hmm. So in a way, those forced changes made Anansi and the other Loas and that went with him more powerful than they had been in the old country. So Anansi is kind of like, I'm trying to think of you might think of Anansi tales kind of like Uncle Remus tales. And I think they may have a similar origin because, again, Uncle Remus comes out of the South and the traditions of the Black South. But Anansi was like always getting in trouble. Like he would try to collect up all of the laughter in the world, right? And it would turn out he would get all of the laughter into this bucket, and then he tried to hide the bucket, but he'd wind up spilling it. And so all the laughter escaped, and he didn't have control of it. And that's why we all have laughter everywhere. It's silly little fables like that are basically for entertainment.
Right. I mean, I think maybe I'm confusing my myth, but wasn't there a Native American myth where the fox was trying to steal fire? And something similar happened?
Well, I think you can find similar myths to that in a lot of the different. I'm not familiar with the fox and the fire one particularly, but Coyote is a well-known trickster in Native American myth, mm-hmm. and he will often pull pranks like that or try to gain power, and it'll go wrong. He'll drop the stick and it'll burn him or something. And he'll always learn things the hard way. And he's always trying to tempt humanity into doing the wrong thing. That's the trickster's role is to become the tempter and to keep you off of the path that keeps you safe and whole and part of a human family.
Yeah. All right. So we're going to go on our second and last break for the night. We'll be back with Debra McElroy. And yeah, I want to ask Debra about elementals when we get back. And I'd like to know if there's any basis to the stories of fairies, pixies, leprechauns, and all these little creatures that are prolific throughout the world. There's all these little hidden creatures that we have to deal with, and that can either be problematic or they can help us out. And where does that come from? This is Alan B. Smith for Paranormal Now, every Sunday, 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on KGRA Radio. I will see you on the flip side.
Not try to capture how I feel and tell you the whole truth, but there's too much to be said, so I just leave you small clues. But now I'm bearing my soul, and my soul loves you. Tell me last things, tell me last things, tell me last things, tell me last things.
Mainstream media's most wanted. KGRARadio.com.
You're lost in a bad way, starting to let go, gone too far the wrong way, can take it all back now. You're lost in a bad way, I've gotta let you go.
Welcome back, everyone, to Paranormal Now. That is it for our breaks tonight. We got 1 hour left with Debra, and we have so much ground to cover. Taking us out of the break was music. To find out more about September, go to Septembrio, spelled with a y.com. All right, so why do you have these little myths about fairies and leprechauns and little people that all over the place?
There are a lot of fairy and little people myths, and most of those tend to be European or Western Asia. So because Russia obviously is huge and covers both Western Europe and East and part of Asia, you've got kind of like separate sections. A lot of what's happening in Eastern Russia is different than what's happening in Western. So you'll find the little people, the little fairies, the elves and that kind of thing more in Western Russia and Europe than you would over in the eastern part of the country. But yes, it's fascinating because Celtic mythology is another great love, obviously given my name. And so it is very, very much attached to a magical realm. Much more so probably in some of the others, which tend to be a little bit more practical. While they have magical elements to them, coyote is still a coyote, right? In Native American mythology, or cats are still cats. But in Celtic mythology, the Tuatha De Danann, who are the fairy people, are actual little fairies. They're a completely different species, a completely different type of individuals, type of creatures than anything else that lives in most of the rest of our world. One of the, there are many, many fascinating things about them, but it's so interesting when you think about, when you say Celtic, a lot of people think that you mean strictly Ireland, but the Celtic people covered much of Europe and way over into Western Asia. Mm-hmm. There have been a number of Celtic burial sites discovered. They got the name Celts from the Greeks, who called them the Keltoi, and they were widely traveled and did a lot of dispersing of their particular culture into other cultures. You can find Celtic motifs in like Norwegian culture. That's very common that they share this similar style of art. You'll also find the way tales are told, the way modes of dress are spread all across that entire half of the world. So it's just really interesting once you know where those things came from originally. In, like you said, Asia, there's the Homo Florencians, which was actual recovered bones of a hominid. And preceding that discovery, there were stories on the island of Flores about a little people that lives there. And I wonder if I'm just as mischievous because that's just how they were, or do we apply that trickster mentality to creatures for some reason? Well, certainly in the case of Celtic mythology, the creatures were inherently mischievous or devious or magical. They were definitely not. They were the best and the worst of humanity. Let's put it that way. They had to be appeased. They were often very vain. They had a lot of powers, that humanity didn't have. And much of humanity's dealings with the little people was dependent on keeping them stable, because we saw them in their realm as being much, much beyond our capacity to understand. We attributed that partly to their godliness or their magical capacity. But in almost all cases, you'll find that fairies, they're more like little butterflies, that they don't really think. They kind of act on just pure instinct. They flit around and they're very hard to see. If you're talking about leprechauns, there's a lot of requirements that you have to jump through, hoops that you have to jump through in order to get a leprechaun to help you. And that's the case with a lot of the little people. They're like very proud and vain and demanding. And if you want any sort of help from them, you either have to coerce them by capturing them, for example, like the leprechaun, and holding them until they do your bidding, or you have to do all the dozen little steps that they require before they'll finally say, okay, I've played with you enough. What do you want?
Have you seen Darby O'Gill and the Little People?
I have. That movie was new when I was a kid. I'm sure it was not for you, but Sean Connery plays the lead character, and he sings and dances and laughs. So if those of you who think of him only as Bond, you need to go rent Darby O'Gill and the Little People. But
he was great in that role. Yeah,
he was great. He was a nobody back then, and it was just it was hilarious. It's hilarious to compare him then to how he would commonly think.
And he has to make dealings with a leprechaun. And it sounds to me like leprechauns are more intelligent than fairies. Is that how you would describe it?
I would say in general, that's absolutely true. It's almost like the bigger the little people, the smarter they are, right? Because when you get down to like the pixies, they got no brains at all. They're literally just like little insects kind of thing. And even Shakespeare writes of the pixies as how they flit about and, visit flowers, and they'll fly off in the middle of conversations and whatnot. And then fairies, a little bit larger, so they're a little bit easier to converse with. And then if you're talking about particularly in Western Russian mythology, you've got house spirits like brownies and things like that. And if you leave bits of food out for them, they'll do you favors. You can think of like the cobbler and the shoe cobbler and the elves, was one of those.
So are they could be considered powerful or just like demigods?
Not that powerful in general. Obviously there are some, but most of the little people are more like they have an little bit of luck, right? Or they have an ability to like push things in your favor rather than grant wishes, particularly. Part of that is why they're kind of devious. It's because that they know they're not that powerful, but they mess with humanity just to get their kicks off, so that they seem like what you're getting is a lot more than what you're really getting.
Sounds like a lot of humans I know.
Yes, they're very, very wicked little things, and wicked not necessarily in a sense of cruel, but sometimes some of them can be cruel, So it is interesting. They're almost like aspects of human personality, right? You've got the ones that are downright hateful. You've got the ones that are a little bit kinder. You've got the ones that try to make use of themselves. You've even got some funny ones, or frightened ones, like the banshee or terrifying harbingers, right? Or the brownies are more about doing chores for you, right? So it's interesting. I would not say that they're anywhere in the near of godly power at all. They just have a little bit something extra that they can give us.
Harry Potter is a new mythology in a sense, using old mythology. Same thing with Lord of the Rings with Tolkien. And those really resonate with people. Deeply so that it's almost obsessive and almost religious like. So what are they tapping into that younger generations are now getting excited about? Because when I was growing up, you had Aesop's fables and other fairy tales like that, but you kind of grew out of it, right? But with these modern updated mythologies, people are adults and falling in love with it, are growing up with it and making it a part of their adulthood. So why do they stick more than like those children's fairy tales?
Well, the fairy tales and the fables and things like that are meant for children. They are for the large part, they are used to teach as you previously mentioned, to teach moral lessons, to teach ways to accomplish goals and things like that. The fox and the grapes teaches cooperation. The ant and the grasshopper teaches thrift and whatnot. But if you're talking about epics like The Lord of the Rings, let's start with that one because it much, much predates Harry Potter. And one of Tolkien's gifts was that he was a professor of linguistics, and he was able to create not just this world from which he drew a lot of Celtic mythology and things, Eastern European mythology into that world, and then created this place that it was easier to inhabit, right? You didn't have to know a whole set of rules for every little fairy that you came across, right? Which you do if you're trying to deal with the fairies, the Tuatha De Danann, in a direct manner. But in Tolkien's world, it's like elves are this fabulous civilization, and they have all this wisdom. And then there's the obviously angry and evil orcs, right? Or the dwarves are very thrifty, but they're also greedy. They work hard, but they're super greedy. And so in a way, he reduced a lot of mythology to its core elements. Good versus evil, strong versus weak, blessed versus cursed, that kind of thing. And so people were able to access it more than they could a lot of these mythologies that came along through over time. And because they came to us over time from so many different sources, they were hard to keep track of. You had to know all of this different information to understand how each one worked. If I were to try and be operating in the world of Western Russian mythology, I have to know a completely different language, a completely different set of rules, a completely different set of ideas and culture.
Yeah.
Versus if I were trying to do that with the Tuatha De Danann, for example.
There's a comment here, not a question, but I thought I'd highlight it from Ojo. Hi all, maybe those myths, etc., is how the pre-religion, such as paganism or animism, interpret the metaphysical being, and it came from the collective unconscious or galactic conscious. What's your take on that?
I love the idea of a cosmic mind. Call that the galactic unconscious or, the higher power or whatever you want to call it. I think, and in fact, a lot of religions, that is their driving force. There isn't a Godhead so much as there is a cosmic well-being. I think Buddhism is a particular example of this sort of cosmic feeling that you're supposed to get to, this centered sense of self that once you get to that, you ascend, right? So I think there's certainly arguments to be made about whether the magic comes out of our sense of trying to attain something greater than ourselves, or whether it's more a result of trying to understand the physical world. I think there's certainly both could be happening.
Yeah, because there is something almost fulfilling when you read Tolkien. I'm assuming you're a Tolkien fan.
Oh yeah,
and
major.
I believe it's actually Tolkien. If I'm
it could be. I think you can argue over it. I'm not positive how it's pronounced. I've always said it Tolkien.
What's your favorite character of Lord of the Rings?
Oh, I'm Frodo.
Yeah?
Oh, yeah, because I'm the one who takes on all the weight of the world, and everything depends on me, and if I don't do my job, the world's going to quit spinning. That's my type A personality.
Do you feel like you've had a scar that can't heal too, like Frodo had?
I don't think so, unless it's my heart. But yeah, if you say that, yeah, I could say that because I tend to carry scars with me for a long time. I don't let go of things. And I also am one of those people who I'll just keep getting back up. You keep knocking me down, I just get up. Whereas it would be smarter to just keep laying down. and I'm just too dumb or stubborn to figure that out. So,
I have to say when in the movies, Peter Jackson's films, the most moving moment, I mean, like, it just brings tears to my eyes, was when they're walking up Mount Doom, and Sam picks up Frodo and puts him on his shoulder and is like, I can't carry the ring, but I can carry you.
Right.
It's actually very profound, because but I can be there for you and lighten your load. And sometimes that's all we can do, right? For those we care about.
Right. And I would submit that, if you had given the ring to Sam, he never would have left the Shire. Right. Because that's not what he is driven by. That's not what motivates him. Frodo is motivated by duty, and Sam is motivated by loyalty. Right. So, it made perfect sense that you give the ring to a person who is motivated by their duty to do whatever is required, and then you give them the person who we know we can count on to make sure that they get their duty done. Because that person who's driven by duty they're not, and I will say this of myself, it's like we don't have the sense of when we should back off, right? Or when we should stop and take a rest, or when we should, use the door instead of trying to walk through the wall, and it's those people who are there for us, who can hold us by the shoulders and say, hey, there's a door over here. You don't have to go through the wall. Those people are essential to getting the job done, to getting whatever the goal of the quest is.
Even in Lord of the Rings, there is a creation myth that he builds into that. And for anyone who's read the Silmarillion, I mean, it really explores that all the more. Of the creation myths that you have looked at yourself, what is the one that's most fascinating? Meaning it surprised you. It was different.
Oh man, there are so many just stunningly beautiful creation myths, and some of the ones that I've read from Asia are they're so different in what I'm used to as a Christian, that it's really tough for me to wrap my mind around. But the ones that I like the best tend to be either South Asian or Polynesian. And they often all involve some sort of giant figure who either rises up out of the vast ocean of the universe, or, they grow inside an egg that's floating in the vast ocean of the universe, or something of that nature. And once this giant figure emerges, it is through their death, their sacrifice and death, that the world is born. There's a Asian one. I'm sorry, I can't tell you what his name is offhand. It's something like Pam or Pan or something like that. But he is the child of the father, the heavenly father, and the ocean mother. Right? Those are common tropes in mythology: the sky father, the earth mother, the heavens, the sun is the masculine energy, the earth, the oceans, the soil is the mother energy, and he's the child of the two of them, and he exists at the border where the two of those meet. He realizes that in order to create the world, he has to die. And so, and that varies from mythology to mythology, but in general, these earths that are created out of these sacrificial figures all tend to have the creature itself, the figure itself, not a creature, the figure has to die. And the beauty of it is the way that the body of the creature, the figure, dies how it dissolves to become the planet. For example, the hair will become the plants and the flowers, right? The bones will become the stones of the mountains. The blood will become the rivers of the world. Every piece of this figure will break down into some physical form on Earth. And it's by that death, that transformation from life to death, that Earth is born. And I just think it's so beautiful. And I suspect I feel that way because I'm an ecologist and I understand the cycle of life, and nature and the environment and all of that, and how the death of each creature contributes to the life of the next creature. Something has to die for something else to live.
The collective unconsciousness, or the archetype that Jung refers to, it, in regard to Ojo's earlier comment and what you were referencing, this idea that there's this collective memory. Mm-hmm. Do you think that when you hear these creation stories, because when I hear that, it sounds very much to me like the formation of the cosmos, because there was a sort of destruction that had to occur in order for order to come. Even just for the solar system. I mean, you had asteroids and rocks that were crashing and fires, brimming from the friction and the pressures. And then eventually it kind of cools down, and then we have life. Do you think that there is something intuitive inside of us that kind of feels where we came from?
Yes. And I would say that to me, that explains that yearning that we have, right? We long to get back to whatever our source was, right? Mm-hmm. We feel like we have been, in some cases, torn from it, or pushed out from it, or somehow we're missing. We used to be part of a great cosmic mind, or part of God's love, or however you want to describe it. And by coming to Earth, we've been pulled out of that oneness that we had. We've been no longer part of the cosmic mind. We're no longer part of the circle of God's love, where we've been removed from that higher power. And that's why we yearn, because we know where we should be. We know we should be part of this thing that's greater than us. And it resonates in us. It leaves that hole that we're seeking. And by the time we come here, in many cases, depending on the mythology, we can't remember specifically that we were part of God or we were part of the cosmic mind. We only remember that we're missing something. And that's why we continue to churn and seek and, all the things that we do.
We have a comment from Alper. Atlantis is not far. I'll just riff on that. Do you think Atlantis is based in reality, or do you think this was just Plato's invention?
I think reality. Honestly, I think that there was at least one very large, well-developed city that succumbed to a natural disaster. Particularly given where Atlantis was supposed to be located, in the Mediterranean, or off the coast of the, Africa, where it depends on, whose version you're looking at. But that's a volatile area. That's a very geologically volatile area. And it makes sense to me that there could have well been a case where the seas overwhelmed a city at some point, right? Whether it was on a coast or whether it was actually an island somewhere out there, I don't know. But it makes absolute sense to me that either as a result of some volcanic activity in the past, or whether it was, the retreat of the glaciers, for all we know, we could have had flying machines and cars and skyscrapers 20,000, 30,000 years ago. And we can't see them anymore.
Right. That's very interesting. Of course, I assume that technology would get so far advanced that it would be impossible to make it disappear, because plastics, for instance, I mean, they last forever.
They do.
And so, perhaps the civilization did advance quite far, but not quite far as us, or maybe in a different way. They may be high tech, but just never, developed plastics.
See, that's kind of along the lines of what I think is that I'm perfectly willing to believe in civilizations that were more advanced than us, that still used organic materials, right? That they were able to smelt metals, or they were able to, build from stone, and they could make steel and that sort of thing. And even if you're talking about steel, over millennia, it will degrade. It will break down. Mm-hmm. So if you're building out of any kind of inherently organic material, it will break down given enough stress and enough time. So it totally makes sense to me that we could have had, ancient Babylon or whatever way before that had flying bicycles or something, but they were made from metals and linens and things that will break down over time.
Sure. Well, even something like a glider, right? I mean, it's actually not that high tech. Maybe they developed some kind of organic material where you could glide and jump off a cliff and fly, essentially, right?
Well, they could have easily tapped ground level petroleum. They could have tapped natural gas resources. In fact, one of the theories for the oracle at Delphi was that it was a natural gas leak, and that when the woman went there, the prophetess went there, the gas kind of gave her these crazy visions and made her lose her senses for a while. And that's why she made all of these great prophecies. And then once she left the temple, she was no longer exposed to the gas. So
I ask a lot of guests this question. Do you, have you heard of the stoned ape theory? And would you subscribe to it? So the theory is that, hominids, humans, early humans, we had only developed so far. We were kind of living in the forests and living off the fruits of the trees, hunting. And eventually we moved out into the plains where there was dung from calf, from ungulate. And that's where mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms, would grow. And that eating these mushrooms or exposing ourselves to certain plants might have been a catalyst to more abstract thinking and sort of forced our brain to evolve. Is that something you would entertain?
I'd certainly entertain that. My education as a biologist would lend me more to think that we had our tree living ancestors, and then we had our plains living ancestors, and that the two of them arose independently of each other. But I could certainly say that the plains living ancestors with their slightly larger brains would have been able to comprehend or at least make some sort of sense of what was happening when they ate those mushrooms versus just stoned apes, if you will. I don't personally see that if I gave a psychedelic mushroom to a monkey, that he's suddenly going to be able to think in a less abstract manner, that he'll be able to cognate better than he would otherwise.
Yeah, I guess the idea would be more like a hominid, an early human that's on the cusp of high intelligence, but just not right there. So somewhere above, the highest ape that we are aware of. I mean, Coco the gorilla could do sign language.
Oh, she could do amazing things. Yeah. She was taught sign language, of course. It's not something that she developed herself, and so. So I think that's one of the gaps between super intelligent animals like dolphins and dogs and apes versus human animals is that we can create stuff out of nothing, and they more or less have to be taught, even from each other. Like if you're talking about tool using animals, there are birds that use sticks to get bugs, right? And of course, monkeys teach each other how to get particular fruits, how to peel fruits, and how to crack nuts and stuff like that. Each generation teaches the next generation. From what we can observe so far, monkeys don't innovate particularly well. Right? They tend to use the same different sets of tools in the same way instead of seeing the same tool and thinking about it in a different way.
Okay.
So I would think that would be the biggest gap. But I can absolutely say that, yes, I believe that psychedelics have played a role in our development as humans, particularly in our development of religion and our development of spirituality. Whether there are interesting documentaries on the effects of psilocybins, which have been isolated from mushrooms, and how they are being used to expand the mind beyond the constraints of certain mental illnesses recently. And I think if you extrapolate from that, you can go back and say that early tribal peoples were able to gain insights from the effects of these plants and mushrooms that they would not necessarily have gotten in other ways.
I hate to argue with someone who has a biology background, but I think dolphins are really smart.
Oh, yeah.
Like, probably above the apes.
I would agree with that.
Okay.
If I said something different, I didn't mean to.
Well, you kind of put them in that category, so I didn't know if you thought that.
You mean if I thought they were equally? I didn't mean to imply they were equally intelligent. I just meant that as mammals go, these are the super intelligent ones: the dolphins, the apes, the dogs. You know, if you're talking about, is a dog smarter than a armadillo or something, right? That's another mammal, but it's not a smart mammal, right?
Okay.
And of course, we cat lovers would say cats are smarter than dogs. And I say that they are definitely smarter than dogs, but the problem is they think in a completely different way.
Correct.
So that makes people think they're not as smart as dogs.
Right. So says the cat lover.
Exactly.
Can you tell us about the Gollum? I remember there was an old X-Files. What is a golem?
The golem is a creature. Is a creature from Jewish traditions, and it is a mannequin, if you will, made from clay. It's made from the clay and the soil. The details aren't really well known about how it is made. Obviously, there's a lot of mystical things that have to bring the creature to life, but it's made from the clay, and then it is imbued in a magical manner, using Jewish mysticism to bring it to life, to do the bidding of the person who created it. So it's not really conscious, right? To my understanding of it, it doesn't have a mind of its own. It's more like a zombie that you're able to program. So you can give it a mission and it will accomplish the mission. If you want it to go, knock somebody's head in, it can do that. But it can't think for itself.
It's like a puppet.
Yeah. It's a self-mobile puppet, right? It can move along by itself, but it needs to have a prescription, if you will, for what it should do.
It's such an odd concept to me in the Judeo tradition. Where did this come from? The concept of a creature like this.
I'm not really that sure. I do know that it's from the what do they call them? not the Torah, for the Jewish
Talmud.
Talmud. Yeah. Okay. It's from that, and it is again attached to Jewish mysticism. It's attached to like man having a dark purpose and sort of like borrowing dark magics in order to create this creature. So it's like, if you think of God as giving life, good and pure life, versus man trying to create life, it's like creating a Frankenstein monster, right? You've got this warped, twisted doctor who thinks he create life on his own, and he creates this horrible monster. Yeah. And the golem is much like that. It's a mindless beast. It's created with dark purposes. You know, you do not make a golem to be a babysitter, for example, right? You make a golem if you want to do harm to somebody.
Is this an example, though, of different belief systems blending and overlapping?
I would say it is. Because I'm not really sure of, all of the origins of the golem, I would say that what we see in modern interpretations, in movies and things like that, when a golem is depicted, we're only seeing the obvious surface of what's going on, right? We can say it's like, I can point to it and say, okay, it's like a Frankenstein in that it can't think for itself. It can be directed, which, connects it to magic or witchcraft in some fashion, and then it does harm. But beyond that, because I do not have a Jewish background, I cannot make those extractions as to what that means to a Jewish person, or in the Jewish religion.
It's interesting. Tolkien used the term golem and turned it into Gollum. But Gollum, he's under the spell, essentially, the force of a dark wizard, a dark, Sauron. But he has emotion, right? He has an internal struggle.
He does.
Which is, I think, one of the most fascinating aspects of that character, because it sympathizes them. In mythology, though, it often seems it's very good versus evil, clean cut, more simplistic and easy to understand when it comes to the hero's journey. Are there examples that you can think of that are more nuanced, where perhaps the protagonist, is very flawed and has an internal struggle, a temptation towards evil?
Well, I think that's a ubiquitous trope, if you will, in a lot of mythology. I mean, what's his name? Odysseus was a very flawed man, and he's probably the model for the hero's journey. In fact, the Odyssey, which is the ultimate model of the hero's journey, is based on his stories. So he's beset by jealous rages. He's incredibly vain. He's a narcissistic. He's, but he's also highly accomplished. He's an amazing athlete. He's a powerful king and leader. He's got all of these great attributes going for him, but he also has some serious personality issues and some character flaws that hold him back. So I think that if you're talking about the hero's journey, I think that because Odysseus had represented so much of the good and the bad of humanity, that's why it translates so well into other formats, right? I mean, almost all quest books are based on the hero's journey. Right. You have a thing, you got to find it. Once you find it, your life is going to be better, but then you got to get back after you find it, and, and you're going to be beset on the way and all of that. So, it translates into almost all of the fantasy books, a lot of regular novels also follow the pattern of the hero's journey. Many, many movies, all action movies for the most part, are based on the hero's journey. You know, John McClane has to get out of the tower alive, right? That's his job. That's his journey, is to go through all of that conflict in order to get out of the tower and save the day. So things like that act as archetypes for other media, in all kinds of formats.
Well, I would say in modern media, Star Wars accomplishes this the best. Luke Skywalker is tempted by the dark side. His father falls completely to the dark side.
Mm-hmm.
I guess you can say he redeems himself. I think if there was a Darth Vader in our world, you know, he'd be locked up even if he, you know, came to the light side. But yeah, to fall that dark, I mean, I think we all have moments in our life where either it's depression or, you know, we've made decisions that we feel just utterly ashamed of. And, you know, we have to kind of find our way back to that self, that center, I guess you were talking about earlier. Even Rey in the latest Star Wars, you know, she's, you know, tempted a little bit by the darker aspects of the Force. And, you know, do you think that these stories really do help us as individuals and as a collective society?
I would say definitely. The hero's journey is almost the archetype, if you will, of the American dream, right? You start out as a nobody, or, you know, a little nothing. If you work hard and you do all the right things that you're supposed to do, you're going to get the gold crown, right? You're going to, whatever your dream is, if it's to own your own business, drive a fancy car, have a great house, have the perfect wife and all of that, or whatever your dream is, if you do the right steps in the right order, which is kind of still magical because we're not exactly sure if it could be prescribed, everyone would succeed, right? So you do the steps in the order, and then you get the prize, and then life is good, right? Because that's the hero's journey. You struggle, you succeed, and you live happily ever after. So if you're talking about Star Wars, I definitely think that they help us because it gives us kind of a model, right? If we had nothing like that we could say to somebody, you know, why should I do anything except sit on my sofa and eat potato chips, right? Mm-hmm. If you could say to somebody, if you are willing to get up off the sofa and do A, B, C, D, and E, at the end, you're going to get this big thing. You know, maybe it's an Uber-sized bag of potato chips or whatever your ultimate heart's desire is. If you're willing, you have to be willing, then you go through the proper steps, you succeed, and you will get a reward, because that's the rule, right? If you're going to follow the hero's journey, the rule is you will be rewarded. So yes, I think it definitely benefits us because it motivates us. It teaches us, how to do something useful with ourselves.
What are you rewarded for exactly?
Well, it depends on your culture, right? In the US, you're rewarded for work, right? You're rewarded for the work that you can accomplish or what you can produce.
But so many people, that's what they struggle with, right? Because they do that and then they find they're completely unfulfilled.
Well, right. But that's the problem is that then what they have is the wrong dream, right? It's not necessarily the process. It's that they haven't identified what it is that will really make them happy. Like we assume that the pot of gold, for example, is what we all want. In this country, the pot of gold is our nation's ultimate reward, whether you want to call that the job or whatever. Our big reward is financial. In other countries that aren't capitalistic, the big reward may be attaining a certain level of spirituality, right? Buddhism has a ton of prescribed steps and things that you go through, and different kinds of transformations and spiritual growth that you go through. And the end reward is nirvana. It is the attainment of this plane that is outside of your physical existence.
So we want to be spiritual capitalists.
Well, what we want is to find out what makes us happy. For some people, the pot of gold makes them perfectly happy, but not for all of us, right? Yeah. And I think particularly for those of us, since I'm a writer, I need to create in order to be happy, right? So I would still write books even if nobody read them. Because for me, my pot of gold is that product that I have created, that end product.
Yes.
And I think artists are the same, right? That, they would say my painting or my sculpture, right? I would still sculpt even if nobody bought it.
Right. Yes. And despite the steps that are given, whether it's, guidance from a mentor or from a mythology, there's still unexpected challenges and hardships. So what is the scariest beast or monster that you've come across in your research?
Oh, man. There are a lot of really, really awful monsters. One of them, I believe it was an Asian mythology of it might be Indian, as in Indian, mm-hmm. But I'm not positive. But it was basically it was the World Serpent, and what it is it's like all of the hills on the hillside were humps in this serpent's body, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, the thing is miles and miles and miles long, and it would eat people. It would go from village to village and eat people. And in one particular family's case, every year it came back and it ate another one of their daughters. And the story is it had to, they had 7 daughters and they were down to their last daughter after 6 years of being preyed on by this thing. And they invoked a man who held a position similar to Beowulf, the great hero. And they converse with the great hero / demigod. How do we get rid of this? What can we do? And he said, if you give me your daughter as a reward, I'll tell you how to kill the monster. Well, if you stop and think about that for a minute, essentially they still lose.
Yeah.
That daughter is gone, whether she's eaten or whether she's given to the hero. Mm-hmm. So it's a catch-22 for them, but they're so gung-ho at the thought that they can take control of this monster that they do all the crazy things they have to do.
That's interesting, because then it begs the question, who really is the monster? Is it the monster itself, the hero who is asking you to do something, that you wouldn't otherwise do, mm-hmm. Sacrifice you wouldn't otherwise make, or you, the one who's willing to make that sacrifice?
I think that's a really good question, right? The parents are certainly monstrous for sacrificing their teenage or preteen daughter to this 3 times older hero. The hero is monstrous for demanding that as payment, mm-hmm. and then demanding the couple go through all the other work that's required to get rid of the monster. And the monster is just a monster. So in many ways, he's the most innocent of all of them, because he's just doing what monsters do, right? He doesn't have an ulterior motive. So who is the worst in that story?
Well, it's interesting. It's kind of like, if imagine Luke Skywalker were to say in Return of the Jedi to the rebellion, okay, I've gotten you this far, but I'm going to require 3 of your youngest women. No, absolutely not. We would all be disgusted.
Right.
Right.
Right. But that's part of our culture as Westerners, that, sure. The hero can't defile the maiden. Right.
That's why, mythology does evolve over time,
and from culture to culture.
Yeah, so we're not totally slaves then to our superstitions or our mythologies.
Not at all. Not at all. We may carry some of them. Like, I tend to be superstitious, partly because I was raised Catholic and partly because I'm an artist. And artists and any other people whose livelihoods depend on performance, like actors and athletes, are always very superstitious because performance has a mystical aspect. It has a mystical aspect. We don't know how it works, right? We know that up to a certain point, you can train and practice and do all that you can do. And there's still some element of luck involved in winning the game, right? You may be the best guy out there on the field. You may shoot the best 3-pointer from across the court, but something could still happen that the other guy wins, right? So there's some mystical aspect that we can't understand that keeps that need, if you will, for superstition. It's like, okay, I know this seems kind of crazy, but I'm going to wear the same orange socks for 7 games in a row and never wash them, right? Because I won the first game in this set of socks, right?
What about you? Do you have rituals that you use?
I do. I'm a big one. If I spill the salt, I throw the salt, right? Yeah. And it's got to go over the left shoulder because the left side is the devil's side. So those of you who aren't sure, it's the left side, okay? When I was little, I never stepped on a crack because I didn't want to break my mother's back. Right. I won't walk under a ladder. I have, I'm, as far as rituals, I don't have as many rituals.
Well, I mean, do you do things to invoke positive outcomes in your life? And then do you think that other people doing rituals, lighting candles, incense, praying to a god or goddess, does that actually have any effect on our lives?
Yes. Whether or not I personally believe that lighting a candle will let my angel see me in the dark or whatever, the fact that the other person does believe that has a positive effect for them, right? So there are plenty of people out there who think that throwing the salt is a silly thing to do, right? But because I do it and it helps me feel better, that makes it legitimate for me, right? I am not a person who is going to say my superstitions make sense and yours are stupid, right? But there are people who will. So I think that it can make us be better people if we're just willing to say, okay, I throw the salt and you wear the socks and we're both a little crazy, and so everything's cool, right?
We'll cover all our bases. Yeah.
If that's the minimum it accomplishes, that's a good thing, right?
Where did breaking the glass equal 7 bad years of bad luck? Where did that come from?
That is out of Roman myth, and Romans were one of the first peoples to discover how to make glass. But it was this very difficult and expensive process. When you're talking, you had to melt sand. I mean, how hot does that have to be that you melt sand and you turn it into glass, and you have to apply the right amount of heat. You have to apply air and that kind of stuff. So it's almost magical. And you think about all of the steps that have to go through, and then you break it.
Sure.
Of course, it makes perfect sense that you've ruined something magical, something that took all of this incredible energy to go into making. Well, you deserve to have bad things happen to you.
So it's kind of like saying to your child, if you cross your eyes, they're going to stay like that. But it's like a threat. Like, we've put so much time, energy, and effort into this thing. Like, don't mess it up.
Don't mess it up. Right. So if you tell somebody 7 years bad luck if you break this thing, you better believe they're going to do all they can do not to break it. Right.
Debra, if you could leave us with one thought tonight, what would that be?
Wow. I think that mythology and spirituality and its place in humanity is very, very underrated. I mean, obviously, if you're talking about religion, plenty of people are willing to say that religion may be a big part of what defines the human animal. But I would submit that religion is just an institution. It's the spirituality that's involved in religion. Religion is the trappings around that spirituality. If you say that spirituality is what makes us human, and that yearning to fill that hole or to seek whatever it is we've lost, then we have a universal experience. There is not a culture on the planet that does not have some structure of spirituality to it.
Yeah.
So I think that is what binds us, right? That it's not because we have thumbs. It's not because we walk upright or because we, know how to use tools. What binds us is the fact that we all have this capacity, mental, emotional, and physical capacity to want to go beyond ourselves.
Debra, where can people find your book?
My book is for sale on all of the outlets, including Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Google. I also have another book that I wrote called Signs and Symbols of the World. That one also is available in those same locations. It just simply talks about some of the manifestations of religion and spiritual symbols and how they came about and what they mean. So it's connected in some ways to this other book.
Okay, and I just dropped the link for her book in Amazon for Superstitions. And Debra, thank you so much.
Thank you, Alan. I really enjoyed being on your show.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. I appreciate it, as always, getting weird with us and getting tonight quite spiritual. I mean, we covered